It's a great pleasure to welcome Rebecca Hale to AUP, and a great pleasure to listen to her talk tonight. Rebecca is a senior research fellow at UCL Center for Holocaust Education and one of the principal authors of What Do Students Know and Understand About the Holocaust? Evidence from English Secondary Schools. She's written about a number of issues within Holocaust education, including the need for more empirical research in primary schools. And I'll just mention one of her latest article. It helped me think how I should treat others and how I should help people who need it, the complexities of exploring the impact of Holocaust education, which was published in Oxford Review of Education in 2020. She's also written about how college students relate Milgram's obedience experiments to their understanding about the Holocaust and the complexities of exploring impact. She leads the center's evaluation activity, studying the impact of its professional development and Beacon School programs. Rebecca began her career as a secondary school teacher before completing a master's and PhD in psychology at Kiel University. Prior to joining UCL in 2013, she worked as a researcher on several projects in the fields of psychology and education. And thank you so much for coming tonight, Rebecca. We're very much looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you. Just bear with me whilst I share my screen. Okay, so I think everybody can see that. Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me here and for being, to provide this first session for this really interesting seminar series. So I really was honoured to be asked. I wanted to just very quickly at the beginning just give a bit of background to myself and the centre that I work with, and then you see on this slide here. I'll then talk in a bit more detail about impact research within Holocaust education, drawing on the paper that Brian just mentioned. Then I've got some new data from the research that we've done most recently that's looking at classroom assessment and the work that teachers are doing to see sort of the impact of their Holocaust lessons on students. So this is data that's not really been shared, it's just a bit of an exclusive. So I've got a few slides with some data. I thought this would be a really nice opportunity to share some of that. And then just some reflections and conclusions towards the end. And I also, on this first slide, just going to give a bit of background about myself. Brian's already done that, so that's very helpful. But I do often begin these sessions by sort of confessing that I'm not a historian, because I think sometimes when you work in the field of Holocaust education, people might expect you to be a historian or to have quite a in-depth historical background in your kind of studies. And I actually come from a psychology background. So I did my degrees in psychology. When I briefly left academia for a few years to work in secondary school, I was teaching humanities. That did involve some RE and history teaching to younger students when they were about 13 or 14 years old in what we would call year 9 in England. But I was mainly teaching older students, 16 to 18-year-old students who were studying psychology, and sort of came to the Centre for Holocaust Education in 2013 after doing sort of PhD in psychology, which was about parents' experiences when their children are bullied. So again, it's still not about Holocaust education, but I came to the Centre for Holocaust Education in 2013 because they were doing this big national survey and they were looking for a researcher who could just do the number crunching, and sort of psychology as a background, so if you do that as part of your training. My intention was to stay at the centre for sort of the 18 months that that project was running, and 8 years later I'm still there because the work that they do is fantastic. It's an incredible place to work. It's really meaningful, really important, really interesting research. And I work with some incredible colleagues and also a lot of amazing teachers and their students. So it's a fantastic place to work, and that's sort of, so my background's not strictly speaking history, although hopefully I'm picking up things after 8 years along the way, but I very much come from more of a psychology and research methods background, hence the kind of topic of this talk. And I'm really pleased, as I say, to be talking at this this session this evening, because I think these sorts of sessions are really important for, you know, lots of people from different disciplines sharing ideas, sharing their experiences. I find this field, Holocaust education, Holocaust studies, genocide studies, you get people from all sorts of disciplines and backgrounds who are contributing all sorts of expertise and experience. And I think that is just really valuable for enriching our understanding. And, you know, I really hope that is, or I'm sure that will be reflected in our discussions towards the end of this session, just sharing of ideas and discussing, because I think you'll find once we get to the end, I've probably got still as many questions as answers, but this is why this is such a fascinating area of work. So just to very quickly give you a bit of a background for the centre where I work, for those who might not have heard of it. So the Centre for Holocaust Education is based at London's Institute of Education, which is now part of University College London. The Centre for Holocaust Education, is funded by the Pears Foundation and the Government Department for Education. So we conduct empirical research with students and teachers, and this underpins a professional development programme that we provide for teachers. And since 2009, over 21,000 teachers in England have participated in this programme. Often history teachers, but also teachers of RE, citizenship, English teachers of lots of different backgrounds, although we have had more history teachers come to us. So the programme consists of numerous elements, right from sort of trainee teachers throughout teachers' careers up to an online master's module and the Speaking School programme, which is a more intensive programme where we work with teachers across a year, and it did involve them coming to London for a weekend and also having a study visit to Warsaw in Poland. Obviously, in the last 18 months or so, things have moved online because of the pandemic, but we're hoping that going forward, when it's safe to do so, that we'll be able to restart some of those face-to-face sessions and these programmes that perhaps, sort of involved elements away from a conference room and sort of on-site learning. So in terms of the research at the centre, there are three of us who are in the core research team, and then there's a wider team of colleagues who are lecturers and do the teacher training, but also feed into the research study. So there's a few of us there who are constantly doing different research studies. Sometimes they might be quite small exploratory pilot work, but we've done three major national studies, which I've listed on this slide here. So research in 2009, which was research with secondary school teachers. And this was the first study of its kind that was done that highlighted all the different areas that a teacher development programme could cover. And that then informed the programme that my centre started running in 2009, that's now over 10 years later still running, and has had lots of additions and amendments, and has constantly been revised and updated in light of the new research that we do. In 2016, we did this research with students. This was a large-scale study with almost 10,000 students in England to find out about their experiences of learning about the Holocaust, and also looked at their knowledge and their understanding of it. So this is the project that I started working on in 2013 when we were constructing the survey and going to the schools to collect the data. Most recently, we've been working on this study here, Continuity and Change. It's 10 years of teaching about the Holocaust in English secondary schools. So the idea of this study was that it was re-engaging with teachers 10 years after the 2009 research. It's not the same group of teachers, but that we're just going back into schools, we're talking to teachers about their practice. So it did start in 2009. It did start 10 years after, it started in 2019, 10 years after the 2009 research. Obviously, with the pandemic, homeschooling, all the other complications that went with sort of working during a pandemic thing, the timescales have shifted slightly, but we are looking to release the findings of that very early next year. As I say, I've got a few findings from that study that I can share with you a bit later on in this presentation. And then other strands of work that the centre do that some of you might be interested in. Colleagues have written a textbook for secondary school students informed by the research that we've done. That is being sent out to schools across the country. So far by the end of the year, 48,500 of those will have gone to over 1,400 schools. And just to give you context, there are about 4,000 secondary schools in England. So it's maybe getting on, sort of a third of the way, just over a third of the way there. Colleagues have also worked with other organisations to develop materials, and there's an example there from UNESCO and OSCE, and also the Centre have produced a MOOC in partnership with Yad Vashem. Anybody across the world, I believe, can complete this for free. It started about a week ago. I think it's still running for a few more weeks. So anybody that's interested, I think, can log into that. And I am happy to make these slides available via the team, because I'm conscious there's quite lots of links here. So if you're frantically trying to write it down, but everything is on our centre anyway. So if you just Googled the UCL Centre for Holocaust Education and went onto the website, you'd find all this information there as well. Okay, and just to give you a bit more context, because it sort of feeds into the direction that the paper that I wrote went in. So Holocaust education in England has been mandatory for students at Key Stage 3, which is when they're aged 11 to 14 years, for a few decades now, since 1991. We found in the past that teachers, although it's 11 to 14 years, teachers typically did it in year 9 when students were 14. That we have seen a shift. Some of that is moving so that students are learning a bit earlier within history. And this is to do with curriculum pressures. There's a paper on the Centre's website where we've talked about that, this squeezing what should be a 3-year Key Stage 3 into 2 years. So I won't sort of dwell on that now, but there is information on that research finding on our website. So it's on the national curriculum. So this would mean it should be the case that students by the time they're 14 will have learned about the Holocaust in their history lessons. It's a very brief bit of the national curriculum. Teachers aren't given any indication of the aims, the content, the duration of the study. They just have to teach it. So it's up to them to pick how and what they teach. We also have this complicated system in England where there's lots of different types of school. And one of the types of school academies, which are increasing, and more academies, more and more schools are converting to academies in England. They don't need to follow the national curriculum. So this would mean they don't necessarily have to study the Holocaust, but we have found that most schools still teach it. A lot of teachers would argue it's a really important subject to teach. It's covered in other subjects. So it does appear in religious studies, citizenship, English, psychology, lots of other subjects as well. But it doesn't have to be taught in that. But we do find teachers, they talk about how they're working with colleagues, or they know of colleagues that are teaching it in other subjects. A lot of teachers will receive maybe a little bit of training about how to teach the Holocaust when they're in their initial teacher training, but it's not mandatory. I think from when we've spoken to them or when we've done research, increasingly they are starting to encounter it, but it might only be, like a few hours, not very much time. So although it's mandatory on the national curriculum for history, it might be variable how much training teachers have had to teach about it. There are organisations, several of them in England, including the one that I work at, that do provide this specialist training, but it is optional. So teachers don't have to participate in this training if they don't want to. So moving on to this article now that was published in the Oxford Review of Education. So it was published in 2020, but I did write it and submitted it in 2019. So I'm mindful that there's been a study that I would have included in the piece that has been published since then. So I'll talk about that a bit later in this presentation. And I'm also mindful that some of the issues and the things that I'm talking about might have been influenced by the pandemic in the last almost 2 years. And these might be things that come up in the discussion later. But I wanted to just give a bit of a background to the article and what the issues that led me to writing it. So I think most people would agree that learning about the Holocaust has an impact on young people. It feels intuitive, and it could be that people recall their own experiences of learning about the Holocaust for the first time, the impact had on them personally. They might also be thinking about the responses of people that they've seen, people they know. So this could be teachers talking about their students. It could be young people observing their friends' reactions as well as their own. So I think most people would say that learning about the Holocaust has some sort of impact. And I've got two quotes. There's 2 big quotes here in the speech bubbles, but there's actually the one as well at the very top of the slide that I included in the title of the journal article. which are the sort of things that we hear quite often from students and teachers. So the student in that article, it being learning about the Holocaust, made me think how I should treat others and how I should help people who need it. So that was a 14-year-old student said that. Another student here, learning about the Holocaust affects you personally. My morals have changed, I think. When you learn about the stories, it affects you personally, that I would never want to be that prejudice against anyone in our community. And then from a teacher, this teacher said the power was in the questions that the students were asking me, the way they listened, the kind of personalization of it. And I couldn't evidence it, but I knew they had learned something. I knew it. So, you know, at my centre, I'm really fortunate, you know, we work with these amazing teachers and students, and it's kind of, I feel quite sad because of the pandemic, we haven't been able to go into schools as often as we had done before. Hopefully we'll be able to start visiting schools again soon. But, you know, but we hear this a lot, and, you know, I'm definitely not here to argue against their experiences. They are their personal experiences. We would not dispute that learning about the Holocaust has a profound and meaningful impact on people. But sort of looking from it with a research lens and trying to sort of pin down what some of this impact is, I think these quotes are quite interesting and sort of raise a few issues and a few questions, or they certainly did with me. And I'm not going to dwell on this now, maybe sort of be thinking about them as we progress through this session, and this might come up again in the discussion at the end. But some of the things I'll talk about will sort of tap into some of the issues that I think are raised just by these two quotes as examples. So that was one element of, that was one thing that was contributing to me wanting to write this paper. The other one is another element was the research context in England. So England, education research in England has increasingly sort of shown an inclination towards conducting randomized controlled trials. And this was probably especially shown in 2011 with the establishment of the Education Endowment Foundation, or the EEF in England, to raise standards in schools. So the EEF recommends randomized control studies, and also something called IPs, which I'll sort of mention on my next slide, but implementation and process evaluations. But very much in favour of RCTs. And there's a quote here that I got from the website, which I thought was quite good at sort of, showing this. So the EEF is funding more randomised controlled trials in education than any other organisation globally. The EEF has more than doubled the amount of available evidence from trials in education in this country, and has commissioned more than 10% of all known trials in education around the world, which is, you know, interesting. We are very, I think in England, we are very aware of this approach to research. Educators, researchers, teachers, we are very conscious that this is a common mode of research for looking at whether different programs, different interventions are working in schools. And, you know, it's, yeah, 10% of all known trials in England around the world. And sort of as a side note, I'd be fascinated to hear what the situation is with other countries, and sort of what they think about RCTs and how they approach them. And just very quickly, actually, I've got another slide just to highlight this. And then I found this the other day. I don't subscribe to The Economist, so I confess I haven't read the article, but I thought that the heading was quite interesting. England has become one of the world's biggest education laboratories. A third of its schools have taken part in randomized controlled trials. So I think, again, this is just sort of showing sort of how I ended up going down the route I went with that paper, because on the one hand, we've got all these teachers in schools talking about this impact that Holocaust education is having on them. It's definitely something that I think is important and interesting for us to research within the field of Holocaust education. But then you're sort of thinking, does that mean that we need to do a randomized controlled trial? Because, especially because that's the context in England, and maybe we should and maybe we shouldn't. I sort of sit on the fence a little bit with that. I think there are pros and cons to both approaches, but it's just, I think, interesting context. And I did note this sentence underneath it as well. The struggle is getting teachers to pay attention to the evidence. As I say, I haven't read the article, but I thought that was also quite interesting. Certainly the teachers that we work with are really responsive and really involved in research. But I'd be interested, it's an interesting sentence, isn't it? Again, might come up in discussions later. So just very quickly, if anybody's not overly familiar with what a randomized controlled trial is, so it's often known by its acronym, an RCT. comparing groups to determine the impact of an intervention. So, or it could be called a treatment group. So for instance, the intervention could be a particular Holocaust education program. So it could be like one of the programs that my centre delivers. And participants, or in education, would be students, are randomly put into experimental or the intervention group and a control group. So half of them will receive it, half of them won't, and then you would compare the outcomes. Now I said half of them would receive it and half of them wouldn't receive the intervention. I think there are different ways of doing it. I'm conscious this is quite a simplistic way of presenting RCTs as well, because there's lots of different designs, different ways of doing it. And the study that I didn't include in my paper that I'll mention later just has quite a clever approach to doing an RCT. But in England, for example, because Holocaust education is mandatory, you couldn't have one group that did a specialised intervention and one group who just had no Holocaust education. They would learn something. So it might be that your control group is, they just have like the standard lessons, the as is approach, the approach that their teacher would normally do without any influence from the intervention that you are interested in. And yeah, just briefly, I did say I'd mention IPs as well, because I don't think that was on my last slide, was it? I was going to just mention that verbally. So an IPE is let me get this right, implementation and process evaluation. So it's often done by the EEF, lots of acronyms, alongside RCTs to establish why and how something has worked. So the RCT kind of produces the numerical data so that you can see if something has had an effect. And then they are now increasingly doing, I'm guessing, kind of qualitative work that sits behind that, so that they, if there is a effect, if something has worked, they can find out how and why. They can explore the mechanisms of that through things like sort of focus groups, maybe sort of open-ended surveys, sort of collect lesson observations. So collecting qualitative data about the interventions. So I think that makes randomized controlled trials more feasible in something like Holocaust education, which we know is very complex. So I think these IPs, these implementation and process evaluations are really good, are a really good step forward. And we're sort of heading towards the mixed method approach. But as I say, at the heart of it, I think, is still the RCT. Sorry, I jumped ahead. So this is the slide here, just to say, before I stop talking about research, randomized controlled trial research methods, is just to note that there are loads of pros and cons to this approach. And you might have heard randomized controlled trials being called the gold standard of impact research. I definitely think that they've got benefits. I'd be very interested to do a randomized controlled trial in Holocaust education, but I know it would be incredibly complex. A lot of thinking. Yeah, it would be, I think, would be interesting, but it would be incredibly complex, lots of considerations. And I think, there are pros and cons to all research methods, but I particularly like this cartoon because I think it just highlights the complexity, especially when you're doing randomized controlled trials in education. It's kind of not like a science laboratory where you're looking at the growth of a tree and you can control all the variables apart from one of interest. There's so many things going on, and people will do their own thing. And, teachers, of course, want to help their students and help them do the best that they can in the topics that they're learning. And so, maybe even the notion of a control group who you're expecting to maybe not do as well as the intervention group is problematic. And, this cartoon here where it's, stop helping people, you're messing up my impact assessment. There are pros and cons. I'm not going to dwell on them here. There are lots of books, there's lots of writing on that. But I guess it's just to be conscious of the fact that although it has been referred to as the gold standard, probably not everybody would necessarily agree with that. And then the other thing that happens in Holocaust education research quite a lot, which was the other motivation for writing the article, is there's quite a lot of research in the field that's claiming impact or causation when actually the data is talking about relationships. So correlational research in itself is not problematic. I actually think, again, that's another really important area of research, and there's almost no point in doing a randomized controlled trial or whatever approach you take to see if A causes B, if A and B aren't even related to one another. So I think correlational research has its place. but we just need to be mindful that in Holocaust education, we're not assuming that an impact has occurred when actually we're just looking at relationships. And it reminds me, as I said, sort of in a previous life, I used to teach psychology to 16 to 18-year-olds, and this really good article that we had that produced that we used to use in teaching, and hoping people are familiar with the tale of storks delivering babies. And this researcher, Matthews, actually looked at the number of human births and the number of storks that visited 17 European countries, and found that there was a statistically significant correlation. It would be really lovely if this was hard science proving, that this tale was true, but we know it's coincidence. And of course, I'm just sort of an extreme example. In education, we would only look at variables that we think are genuinely related to one another. But we need to be mindful that these things can function in both directions. So you might, for instance, or it's intuitive to think that learning about the Holocaust and students who are engaging with Holocaust education are more likely to then engage in pro-social behaviour. But it could be that your students that engage in pro-social behaviour are just the ones that are going to be more engaged in learning about the Holocaust. And it might not even be possible for us to untangle some of these things. They're so closely sort of knitted together. But it's just about, when we are writing research and when we're reading about research, just being honest about whether we're talking about correlations and relationships, or whether we are actually talking about A causing B. So there's lots of complexities and challenges of exploring impact, which I think I've already alluded to. And, I just put a few on here. There'll be more than this, but, what are we measuring? How are we going to measure it? Taking into account of what students already know. If you're doing a randomized control trial or any sort of study, your students will be starting at different baselines. And also we've got the gradual longer term impact. So students might be impacted by the Holocaust, but they might not act on that straight away, especially if you're 12 or 13 years old when you first learn about it. These are the sorts of things that, the seed is there and it grows, and it might be in a few years' time when you're a bit older and you feel like you've got agency, that you can start going out into your community and feel that you want to start making an impact. But at 12, 13 years old, you might just be starting smaller scale or still thinking through some of these things. So again, this is the complication with Holocaust education. These sorts of lessons can stay with people for their whole entire lifetime sometimes, but it's not easy to capture that if you're just issuing students with a survey 2 hours after that they've had their lessons. So in that list of complexities, the one that I would just spend a bit of time talking about now is looking at the aims of Holocaust education. So right at the very beginning of this process is, what exactly is it that we think Holocaust education is doing? What impact is it having? So I just wanted to quickly sort of flag up a debate within Holocaust education about what the aim should be. So there's sort of two different sides, and again, this is very shorthand. It's a lot more complicated than this, but just to sort of shorthand basic structure is, it should on the one side Holocaust education be primarily based on students developing historical understandings, or should it relate to social, moral, or sort of civic outcomes? This is a long-running debate, and some of you might know the article written by Nicholas Kinloch in 1998, where he wrote in support of Holocaust as history. He argued that teaching approaches which present cautionary messages about discrimination, warn young people not to participate in or be indifferent to future genocides, are problematic because students will make their own moral and social judgments, which are unlikely to be affected by their teacher. And other teachers and researchers have commented that the kind of this does happen sometimes. So I found an article by Alexander Kahn in 2012, and he was recounting an experience with his students, and found that attempting to imprint kind of this moral lesson by connecting the past to the present just felt a bit superficial to his students, and you can unwittingly risk students rejecting this view rather than adopting it. But I think sort of history on one side, social, moral on the other side, like I say, it is simplistic, and I don't think that they're necessarily at odds with one another. And certainly colleagues at my centre have argued for the importance of students first developing the secure knowledge about the Holocaust, and then they can be supported to reflect on that, critique it, and draw meanings, lessons, as it were, from that. But once they've got the secure, sound core knowledge about what happened during this period of history. And again, my colleagues have written about this, that of course, history teachers might want to, or history students will, you would imagine, be learning elements of the history. But if you're teaching about the Holocaust in other disciplines or different curriculum areas, then it might be that you are interested in spiritual, moral, civic aims. But even so, I think my colleagues have sort of argued, and I would agree with them, that actually having this secure historical knowledge is very important. So in terms of just a couple of research examples, I think I've done quite a good job at first steps at trying to tackle this big knotty issue of impact within Holocaust education. So I mentioned that there was 2 studies that I would talk about that had attempted to do a randomized controlled trial within this field, because it is very complicated. And I say, as a general rule, people haven't attempted it, and I sympathise. I think it would be really complicated. But 2 have been published, potentially more have been done. I haven't come across them yet. I'd love to, if you've got examples, I'd love to hear about them. But I found 2, interestingly not done in England, after I told you all about how much England like to do randomized control studies. So these were both done in America. So the first one here by Dennis Barr in 2015. So they were looking at the impact of the Facing History and Ourselves programme. So just quickly, I don't think it's on the slide, so I've noted it down here. It's a non-profit teacher professional development organisation providing support to secondary school teachers and students to make connections between social history, norms of human behaviour, and the civic and moral choices confronted in their daily lives. So as you can see from this slide, this was a very large study with teachers and students. The programme actually had more impact on the teachers, or it appeared to have more impact on the teachers than it did with the students. You can see here 10 out of the 12 teacher outcomes were significant. It was the case that 5 out of 15 of the student outcomes were significant there, and that the programme appeared to have less impact on young people. I think there are a few interesting things to note here. So first of all is that the programme is delivered to teachers. So they participate in seminars, workshops, coaching, mentoring, have access to resources. The seminars that they attend are typically 5 days and allow the teachers to engage with all the content, the themes, the practices, and the resources that they would be using in their own classrooms. And they also had follow-up meetings after the programme to help them to implement this with their students. So these teachers are receiving the programme in the purest form. And it's a model similar to what you see in England. So my centre, other centres that or other organisations that work with teachers, is sort of the specialist educator delivers the programme to the teacher, and the teacher goes off and delivers it to their students. And of course, they can vary how they do it. The students aren't getting the pure form. It's kind of, as it goes along the trail, things getting changed along the way. And things have been presented through the lens, the interpretations, the knowledge of the teacher. So in some respects, you could argue it would have more impact on the teachers potentially, because they're the ones that directly receive the programme. The other thing that I always wonder about with these things is it's not necessarily that the program that the teachers delivered based on that program, that it's not necessarily that program didn't have an impact on students or didn't have a huge impact. It's maybe how we measured it. So it might be that some of the tools that we used didn't tap into what the impact is. And again, there's no simple answer to this. It's just so difficult. It's so difficult to design measures that tap into attitudes and behaviours. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, this could be an impact that manifests itself in a few years' time. It's incredibly difficult. This is where qualitative research might be useful. Speak to the students after they've been on the programme and find out what their personal experience is. And then maybe from that, we can develop new surveys, questionnaires, measures that could be used on a larger scale like this. So I think I'm always mindful when I read these and they say, oh, you know, we didn't find an outcome, or it wasn't as great as we thought. It's like, well, you know, not necessarily, because we, you know, without speaking to the young people, you don't always know what sort of impact it has had on them. So the next one that I was quite excited to find, which was published in 2020, which is another large-scale randomized control study. So this one was looking at the impact of a school-sponsored visit to the Holocaust Museum in Houston. So students were split into an intervention group and a control group. And how they did this was all students, regardless of what group they were in, completed the survey before and after their visit to the museum. They completed a survey before and after they visited the museum. The intervention students completed beforehand the demographic questions, you know, sort of, I guess, just like I don't know, where they lived, and, you know, just information about themselves, and then and a series of unrelated, or they've called them in the paper unrelated survey questions. And then after the intervention, they completed the survey that the researchers were actually interested in with the outcomes of interest. So because they did that survey afterwards, we can look at what the we're looking at their answers after the intervention, and potentially have been influenced by visiting that museum. The control group, they did that key survey 1 week before they went to the museum. So their responses weren't influenced by this intervention. So they did it 1 week before, and then the week after. So after they'd been to the museum, they then just did the unrelated questions and the demographic questions. So I thought this was quite a nice study to address the issues of control groups potentially missing out on what is an effective intervention. So I thought that was kind of one merit of this. The other thing that we often see in impact research, where students do surveys before and after an intervention, if they do the same survey because you want to compare the same student, the same student, their responses before and afterwards, is you always get practice effects. So they often will do better in the second survey, not necessarily because of the intervention, but just because they've done the survey before. They might have gone off and looked at the answers, or they might have had a nagging feeling that one of the answers were incorrect, and then it sort of, you know, strikes them later on that evening when they're having dinner, that was actually the answer to that question. And so this is quite a nice way of overcoming some of those issues. And this study found 3 statistically significant results, which are on the slide there. The students were more likely to prefer protecting civil liberties over efforts to maintain order. They were more likely to demonstrate high levels of historical content knowledge about the Holocaust, and that they were more likely to respond less positively on religious tolerance items, which I flagged up in red there because that was the unexpected finding. And if I just show you this slide here, so this is an excerpt from their article where they account for these findings, so I'll just read that out. It says, the negative religious tolerance result is concerning. However, it is worth noticing that differences do not reflect treatment students being more likely to exhibit intolerant positions as a result of their educational experience. Rather, both treatment and control students overwhelmingly endorse tolerant positions, with differences in responses largely reflecting different levels of agreeing and strongly agreeing with tolerant positions. Therefore, this result could be attributed to ceiling or framing effects. Teaching students about the Holocaust may induce deeper reflections on the notion of religious tolerance, and as a result, students in the treatment group may see these survey items through a different lens. So, I mean, you might have different thoughts about how that finding came about, but what struck me is something that I've seen in other studies is where students have already got high levels of acceptance, or if you want to use the word tolerance, they're already quite aware of these issues. And actually, when they learn about Holocaust education, it's not necessarily having an impact on them that's new or different. It's maybe reinforcing things that they already knew. So the quote that was on, you know, sort of the article that we mentioned at the beginning about, you know, being more inclined to help people. I mean, arguably these students already know that they should help people and be nice to people and help others in their community before they learn about the Holocaust. Now, that's not, well, going back a step, on some of the studies that I've looked at where they've had this finding where there hasn't been much difference because the students' attitudes were already really positive, sometimes it might be statistically significant, but when you turn those numbers back into sort of the number of students, it might only be 2 or 3 students who've changed their opinions and everybody else kind of kept the same positive opinion. I mean, arguably, even if a program is having an impact on just one student, I mean, that's still really incredible and should be celebrated. And, you know, and that's not to be criticized, because for every one student that we can get, you know, sort of thinking in these more positive ways, I mean, that can only be a good thing. But I suppose the question is about what else can Holocaust education and programs like this do? What else can they offer students? What other ways can they develop their thinking? I mean, the contemporary world is complicated, quite scary at times. There's lots of things going on. Things are always changing. Like, what can we as educators and researchers do to help students, you know, in various different ways? So I'm not knocking, you know, these studies that maybe only have, you know, go from being very, very positive to even more positive. I mean, that is brilliant, but it's also about the other ways that we can be having an impact on students. And just very quickly, I've just the last bit, I'm just conscious of the time. So I mentioned that I would share some findings that were coming through from our latest research with teachers, because I've been looking at this, I was looking at this data over the summer, and it sort of struck me that there was overlap between the issues that teachers were grappling with when they were trying to work out whether what students were getting out of their lessons, and whether their outcomes of Holocaust education or Holocaust lessons have been achieved. There's crossover or connections between what teachers were grappling with and what researchers were grappling with. So certainly in England, when teaching about the Holocaust, as I said, the national curriculum doesn't really tell teachers how they should do that, and it's the same with assessment. So it's up to teachers if they want to assess students' learning when learning about the Holocaust, and some of them might choose to monitor or assess it in the lesson just through informal questions and answers, or they might decide to do it more formally in an end of unit exam. They're of course talking about issues to do with progression and assessment. You know, researchers are talking about interventions, treatments and impact, but sort of trying to grapple with the same things about, we've decided that our students should learn about this. How do we know at the end of it that that has indeed happened? So when I was looking at this data, I was thinking in terms of assessment referring to the activities that teachers are using to determine the extent to which learning objectives and outcomes have been met. So this could be historical knowledge outcomes, or it could be sort of more social, moral or civic outcomes. And also when they were talking about progression, this isn't usually just about learning more facts or learning more stuff. It's about expanding their understanding, you know, sort of developing it in different ways. And of course, in different subjects, this will mean different things. So as I've mentioned, it has to be, or it should be taught in history in England, but we also get RE, citizenship, other subjects that teach it. And of course, those teachers would have, you would imagine, would have different aims. And that, of course, does then influence the assessment that they might be using. But it's interesting to note that we have found in research in 2009, and it's come out a little bit in the latest research as well, that history teachers, as well as looking at historical aims, have also got all these other social, moral, kind of civic aims as well as part of their teaching. So it's kind of interesting data to look at to see how they go about trying to assess these broader aims. So I'll just read here so I get the numbers correct. So we collected, or we did a really large survey about all areas of teachers' practice. So just to make you aware, this bit about assessment was a very small, very short question, just one element. So this only gives us a snapshot, and actually it would be really interesting to do a more developed study with teachers about how they use assessment. So kind of that's on the to-do list, but this just offers us a snapshot and some insight. But as I said, it just got me thinking, because of all the stuff I'd been sort of thinking about the year before to do with research and impact research, and then sort of reading the teachers' discussions about assessment. So, so the data were collected from a very large survey, and we had one open-ended survey question that said, please briefly explain. So again, it just say briefly, so we have to be, you know, sort of aware of the fact that this isn't going to be absolutely everything that teachers do. Please briefly explain if and how you assess or monitor students' learning throughout your scheme of work about the Holocaust. So 761 teachers responded to this question, and their responses varied from a single word to 220 words, but the vast majority of teachers, 86.3%, provided responses of 50 words, so 50 words or less. And additionally, we conducted a series of individual and group interviews with 134 teachers from 45 schools and asked them how they knew they'd achieved their teaching aims. So across the survey responses, almost 1,400 activities, tasks, and modes of assessment were identified, with almost 90% of teachers saying that they did something to assess their students' learning. But some key things emerged, and it's what I've noted here, that they felt that assessment within Holocaust education wasn't appropriate, that they kind of had a sense of the impact on their students rather than collecting sort of data from maybe a standardized test or an assignment that they might use on other topics that they teach. And but teachers, they were aware of the challenges of this and the contradictions and the tensions in the approach that they were taking in Holocaust versus how they taught about other topics. So in terms of this not being appropriate, they felt it wasn't appropriate to use assessment in their Holocaust education schemes of work, and were less inclined to, because of this, to include written work that signaled the measurement of progression or involved them assigning grades or students feeling like they were being tested or this was an exam. So as this teacher says here, mainly through discussion, we try not to make the unit about their assessment or progress and emphasize that it's about their own personal, moral and ethical development. So we do see a departure, so this is for history teachers, we see a departure from what they normally do, where it might be more written work based. And we've got evidence from the Historical Association survey with schools in England, where they found that in general, so this isn't about the Holocaust, just their general history teaching, that written tasks are the most frequently used assessment activity in Key Stage 3. So that's the stage that we learn about the Holocaust, with 2/3 of respondents using written activities. Over half of teachers use, I say GCSE style exams. Those of you that know GCSE, that's the stage after Key Stage 3. So they're already getting students into the habit of answering these exam questions. So half of teachers are doing that. And half of teachers, almost half, are using factual knowledge tests, but they're not doing that in Holocaust education. They're doing something different there. And with that, they tend to be not having assessment of historical knowledge as their prime or sole aim. I mean, some of them are looking into that, but actually what they're more interested in is monitoring students' development in broader socially orientated ways. So they're drawing on their knowledge of their students' characters, they're observing their responses in sort of group discussions, they're providing these opportunities for students to engage in reflection. And because of that, they're not sort of collecting the normal information that they might have, be it an essay or whatever, and outcomes they will find you are more difficult to pin down. So they say things like, I knew, you can see, I could feel that they'd learned something. So sort of basing things on instinct rather than what they thought that rather than, you know, sort of the tangible things that they thought their students had achieved. So just here, yes, this teacher says, I wouldn't say anything that was comparable to what I would say in other topics, but I think you can, by the end of the unit you've taught, see how the girls' misconceptions and preconceptions have changed. And then we've got some teachers here just talking about the challenges of this. I think it's a really interesting question because it does highlight that we've got all these aims we want to achieve, and how would we actually know that we've achieved these? I think that what everybody said about discussion work, this is discussion with students, as a teacher, you can read how your students are responding in a lesson. That's quite a soft way. It's not very easy to evidence. And another teacher here saying, I felt very strongly that I don't need to have knowledge tests on the Holocaust because I feel that loses the impact of it. One of the reasons that we've kept the formal assessment the way that we have is because that keeps us moving forwards with the needs of teaching the curriculum, the progress, the assessment requirements that the school have as well. I think teaching the Holocaust can be problematic, trying to marry up all those different ideas about what is our role as teachers and as educators. Is it to get them the skills to pass an exam, especially in this context where it's grammar schools, it's high achieving? We do have that expectation that those skills are developed from the ground up. Is it to broaden their horizons, make them citizens of the world, or is it to foster a love of the subject? And trying to balance those three with any subject can be difficult. But when you've got the morality issue that comes when trying to teach the Holocaust as well, this makes it even more of a complex issue. So there are these tensions here. Now, sort of mindful that for educators and researchers who are trying to work out what are the aims of Holocaust education? What do we want students to have achieved by the end of it? You know, how do we pin this down? You know, teachers are sort of saying, oh, I know I'm not doing essays or exams, I'm just using discussion work, and it's kind of one teacher said it's a soft way. So teachers are grappling with this, and then researchers as well finding it really difficult to define exactly what students should be able to do by the end of it, or what the impact should be, and then how do we measure it. But just want to make sure that we don't go down the route of thinking that we should only measure what can be measured. And there's a nice quote here from Biesta: the predicament here is whether we are measuring and assessing what we consider valuable, or whether bureaucratic accountability systems have created a situation in which we are valuing what is being measured, i.e. a situation where measurement has become an end in itself rather than a means to achieve good education in the fullest and broadest sense of the term. And of course, it would be problematic to assume that if a concept can't be measured or quantified, then it shouldn't be an outcome. I mean, you know, learning about the Holocaust, you know, any of these sorts of subjects, very profound. You know, we're learning from the Holocaust as well as about it. But given that, and that there's a sense that Holocaust education is having an impact on students, I do think it's important for us researchers, educators, teachers to start thinking about what is the impact that we want to have on students, and how can we make these programs as meaningful to them as possible. And I would sort of align with my colleagues who say that underpinning all of this is definitely the need for sound historical knowledge. And the study that I did with colleagues in 2016 unfortunately found that certainly students in England had quite a lot of misconceptions about the Holocaust, and this this will have an influence on the meanings or the lessons that they're kind of taking from that history. So the example I put on the slide here is most students overestimated the proportion of people who were Jewish in the pre-war German population. So a lot of the students, you know, sort of said 15, 30%. But actually, if students do not know that the Jewish population was a minority group constituting less than 1% of the pre-war German population, then any impact that, you know, we hope would have on their attitudes towards prejudice, tolerance, minority groups is undermined if they don't know, you know, some of these fundamental pieces of information about the Holocaust. So just as I draw to the end, mindful of the time. So I think sort of having recognised that, I think there's probably consensus, you know, amongst those in the field, that we want students to learn something as a consequence of studying the Holocaust. I think we just need to start thinking about exactly what it is we want them to learn, and how we would measure something like that. I personally think that an element of that should be their historical knowledge, but absolutely all the other outcomes that have been spoken about, because different programs, different units of study that teachers are delivering will have different, you know, aims and projected outcomes to them. So of course, we should be looking at all these other elements as well, as challenging as they are. But I think historical knowledge is an important element of that. Randomized controlled trials are just one way of measuring impact, exploring impact. I'm not against them. I kind of sit on the fence a little bit with them. I think they've got some advantages, and I think some of the few that have been done provide us some really interesting insights, and I feel like it might be inevitable that we end up having one in England at some point that looks into Holocaust education, but it's just being mindful of the complexities. And I still don't think, as much as it will tell us something, there's still lots of other things that we need to know about Holocaust education that a randomized controlled trial can't necessarily tell us. And I think qualitative work, mixed methods work is a really good way forward. And educators and researchers, teachers and researchers working together, I think is a really positive thing as well. We're sort of grappling with the same sorts of issues, and often as researchers, we're exploring the interventions that teachers are delivering. They might not, some of them might have designed them themselves, or they might be delivering somebody else's intervention, but you know, the teachers are a key element of this. It's so important to work with them, and of course they're students, and to actually ask the students themselves, what impact has this had on you? I think there is a shared concern about identifying what exactly students are getting out of this and making sure that these programs can be as impactful as possible. So this is my last slide now. So what next? And I feel like I've posed more questions than I've answered. I think this is a really complicated area, but I think it's a really interesting area. And I think it's through having discussions like this, and why it's so exciting to be at this event, and hopefully there will be more like it, we can start drawing on everybody's ideas and expertise and start looking for a way forward in this area. Yes, that's the last slide. There we go. I'll just mute myself.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to open the discussion, and not only because I can get rid of my mask, but mainly because it was really an inspiring talk, and I'm sure because we are very lucky here, we'll be able to pursue the discussion after, because there are so lot to discuss.
Can you remind people that they can ask questions in French?
Of course. So I'm being told that I need to remind you that you can ask questions in the chat, but also orally, just after my introduction of the discussion, in French and English. Don't worry about the language. We will find a way, and I will translate, or Constance, we will get organized. But I will going to discuss first in English for Rebecca to understand. So really, this is really fascinating, and I'm a sociologist. So at first I want to tell you that you're entitled not to be an historian. And actually, especially here in the French context, and Constance, who is an historian, knows, I've been struggling for years, and it could be described even as one of the core thing I've been doing since I've been working on memory, to legitimate it as a topic of research for people who are not historians. So please feel free to contribute even without, and even I think it's better not to be a historian, because it enables, in a way, it makes you freer in the way you see the object. And of course, I'm the president-elect of the Memory Studies Association, so I like to work with historians on memory, but it's important that historians do not stay among themselves to discuss and explore memory issues and dynamics. I think I will have 5 main points for the discussion, but before I start, I wanted really to say how much I appreciated all the methodological inputs you gave, even the discussion about the RCT. Being the co-advisor for PhD in biology on memory, I must say that it's very important to consider seriously the RCT, but also critically, because if not, we are going to end studying people as we do with flies. And if we wanted, in the case you presented it, in my opinion, is that if we wanted to really do RCT, we will have to put these students in the situation we want them to act as we would like them to act, like in this social psychology experiment of the Good Samaritans, where the students were put into the situation where they had to decide if they want to help someone or not. Because at the end, Holocaust education is not about history, is not only about moral values, but it's also about behavior. And this is something maybe we need to keep in mind when we discuss this methodology. So my first question will be, so I'm not an historian, but I'm very much interested in history, and especially in history of institutions. So I wondered if, for us who are not specialized in the British context, you could give us more information about the very reason of the creation of the center and of the introduction in 1991 of Holocaust as mandatory topic. Because I guess that, for example, the history of Second World War has been taught in the UK since the end of Second World War. And how did that evolve, and how institutionally and historically speaking, was it decided in 1991 to introduce this for 7K as a mandatory part? In most European countries, it came out of the Stockholm Agreement in 1999. So this comes before. And I wanted to know why, and is it because it was introduced that the center was also created to study this, or are the two independent? So can you tell us more about that? And what was the explicit aims given by the state, I mean, the administration, the government, I don't know how to speak in the UK, but in French, we will say the state, in this decision of 1991. The second group of questions I would like to raise is the one of social differentiation, because in your presentation, you spoke of students, teachers, with the plural, and I wanted to know if you could tell us more about how this impact works depending on who the children are and who the teacher are. For example, let's say a very basic differentiation, girls and boys. Mm-hmm. Do you have data, studies and things you saw in the studies the center have been doing about this issue of social differentiation at the scale of the students and also at the scale of the teachers? Because you said in several times that the teachers you worked with were very committed to the study, etc. So is it on the basis of a voluntary participation, how they are picked? Is it something which is asked for by the institutions? Is it, for example, career speaking valued if you take part in such study, which may be the case considering what we presented about the, I don't remember the acronym, but the EEFFF stuff. Yeah. The third group of question will be the coming from this second one and asking if in a way you think we should assess this impact at the scale of the student or at the scale of the class. For example, in some of the quotation you gave about the teachers, one quotation says the girls. So I got it was a school only for girls, mm-hmm. as they have in the UK. Mm-hmm. So I wondered if you saw that this kind of issues could be different depending, for example, again, I will stay with gender, but we can have a lot of other social differentiation regarding the fact that the group is made only by girls or by boys, etc. What do you think, methodologically speaking, where do we should look at as a student per se, as an individual, or more as a group or subgroups, or and also where should we do the study, in the school or outside the school? Even if it's to assess the impact of the school program, does it change something to work inside the institution or outside of this institution? And I'm like you, I really much like to raise questions. I don't have all the answers, so it's absolutely nice if you don't answer to this question. It's more a way to move on the discussion for us and also for the participants online. For a group of remarks, I totally agree. You cannot imagine how much with what you said about the fact that students already have the kind of values we want to give them through Holocaust education. Actually, I published an article on that, on a group of students, like 9-10 years old, groups, actually 15 classes, who went to visit an exhibition about the Holocaust, and all of them were coming from inner city schools. And I was really struck by the fact that as soon as they entered the first room, which was about stigmatization, like the yellow star, etc., they said, oh, it's such racist, it's horrible, they should have called the police being the one who arrested the Jews in France. But they came with their values already, and it was a way to reactive them and to express them publicly. So this being said, I wondered why are we always focusing on youth in the study of Holocaust impact as values, because when we look the other way around and we look at studies who document racism and anti-Semitism, we see that the young people are not always the most racist or anti-Semitic. Actually, most of them are older people. So how do you articulate, and do you know studies who do articulate this ideas of not always focusing on youth, but also on other type of group, depending on age? And my last remark will be about something you referred to several times, the differentiation between values and historical knowledge, which I think it's crucial and very difficult to work with. And you say that you and most of your colleagues at the center were convinced that we need first to focus on sound historical knowledge. I think it was the expression, which I agree. Even if I would like maybe to know more about what is knowledge. Do we consider we transmit knowledge to the students, or we transmit like inquiry practices of how to make history, how to build history, how to use an archive, how to use testimony? Is there also practical issues in there? But this being said, a lot of studies in memory studies show that from the very same sound knowledge, like same people know very well, very well what happened. They take very different moral and contemporary lessons for that. So there are a lot of pieces about that, but like the Howard Schuman work on the interpretation of the Vietnam Wars regarding the case of the Iraq War situation, he showed that depending on several criteria, among which race, residence, etc., some people learned from the Vietnam Wars not to go to Iraq for the US, and others learned from the Vietnam War to go to Iraq and invade Iraq. So I wanted to know, what do you think of that, and what do you make of it, methodologically speaking, in the kind of research you and the center have been doing and will be doing? And I hope maybe, and it will be my last point as a conclusion, maybe with other countries. Can you tell us, because you say you were looking for comparative approaches, so here for the French case, we can give you some reference at some point, but I wondered if the work you have been doing have been comparative, or how would it make it comparative? Do you think it will be meaningful, or these issues are so linked to the institutional and national context of education policy that it will be difficult for you in your experience to build a real comparison? Of course, if I speak of France, the situation is very different, but there are also a lot of things you said and a lot of methodology you presented that I think could be implemented here too. Thank you so much.
Okay, so all right, thank you very much for those questions. I think I can say something for most of them, but where I can't, I can point you in the right direction, hopefully. So in terms of the background to Holocaust education in England, and it went onto the national curriculum in 1991, I think my colleague has written quite a lot about this, Andy Pierce, so I definitely recommend having a look at his work. I don't know a huge amount about the ins and outs of it, but I know it was complicated. There was lots of discussions and panels who fed into it. 1991 was when they reworked the national curriculum in England. So this was part of a whole sort of reworking of lots of different areas. And it was felt that it was really important for students to learn about the Holocaust in history. And it's my understanding that because of the nature of the content, that it was originally going to be on the curriculum for older students, but that when they decided to make history optional for students after Key Stage 3, so once they were aged 14, 15 and over, if the Holocaust was for older students, then of course that would mean those that didn't pick history, I think you kind of pick between history and geography. If they didn't pick history, then they wouldn't learn about the Holocaust. So it was felt that they had to learn about it, and so it was moved down to this Key Stage 3 where history was compulsory. And as I mentioned, traditionally teachers had then waited until the very end of year 9 when students at the very end of that key stage, because of the nature of the topic, and making sure that they were as old and as emotionally mature as possible within that key stage. But like I said, seeing that is moving down a little bit now. They never really said why, which was part of the sort of the confusion for teachers. And certainly when you read the 2009 research that we did with teachers, they were sort of asking these questions, you know, why we teach now, what are the aims meant to be? It was just there as kind of like a sentence or two that this should be included. So there are a lot of writings on this. I'm sorry, it's not my area of expertise, but like Andy Pearce is a good person to start with looking at that. Of course, there are theories, I guess, and there's the way the Holocaust has sometimes been taught, and the narratives and the stories that have been told maybe serve a function sometimes for government. So, for instance, we've worked quite closely with schools and students within the last few years to talk about what the British response was, because there was a sense that came through students, through the student research, that, you know, Britons were the heroes and they kind of saved the day. And, you know, this is very complicated. It's a lot more, obviously, as we know, it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think, yeah, so people have got different theories about why the Holocaust was put on the curriculum. And like I said, definitely read Andy Pearce. So I don't want to sort of start giving a skewed perspective on it, but I think it wasn't necessarily entirely clear to begin with. And some people would maybe arguably say that the aims haven't been really crystallized or stated in any sort of national curriculum documentation. And then you asked about how the centre came from that. Correct me if I've miswritten, like when I've written down questions, I've misunderstood them in any way. So the role of the centre in this. So the centre came about because we colleagues who set up the centre were teachers working in schools and knew that teachers were struggling to teach about this subject, and identified that there were problems in the way it was taught. My colleague Ruth Ann Lenger and Stuart Foster were there at the beginning, setting up the centre, worked very closely with teachers in schools and through museum work, and they knew that there was a concern about how to teach this subject in an appropriate, sensitive, accurate way. And so the centre was set up just as a programme originally. So it was within the Institute of Education, and it was just a programme for teachers. And then it develops through, and the research was done, the 2009 research was done to feed into that, that teacher development programme. So we are separate. Since then, we've gone on to become the research centre. The team has expanded. We do more research, and there's more programmes on offer. And I did mention that we were funded as well, part funded by the Department for Education, but we are independent of them. We kind of set what we do, and they just very generously funds the teacher training element, so that it means that teachers who participate in the programme can do so for free. But in terms of the content and the research that's done it, we sort of set that agenda. It's not sort of, so it is independent to the government in that respect. Is that everything on that section of questions? Yeah, okay. And then, so then we were looking at, the differences with the students and the teachers who are involved in the research. So, and does it make an impact on students depending on the backgrounds of the students and who they are? To be honest, I don't really have a clear-cut answer with that, because we've not done that level of research to know yet. I mean, personally, for me, we've done research where we've collected at one point in time, so it's not impact research. So we haven't done like a before and after or an intervention. We've done this research in 2016. with lots of students, almost 10,000 of them. And we collected data on their year group. I think we did collect gender, ethnicity, and I think if their family belonged to different religious groups. But we didn't find any differences in their knowledge, or we did use some kind of attitudinal questions. Yeah, I don't know how much information, they maybe were a bit limited in the information that they could give us, but we didn't find any differences between groups of students, apart from age group, of course, and that the older the students were, the more that they would know, and especially in the students who had chosen to study history and had gone on to do it sort of from 15 years, and then just before they went to university at 16 and 17 years old. And I haven't really noticed too much in anything that I've read either that said, I think sometimes I remembered, I can't remember where I read it, about maybe that girls are sometimes a bit more responsive to some of these programs, but whether that's maybe just because if the teaching style, or they just respond to these lessons a little bit more than some of the boys do, but nothing concrete that I can really sort of mention to you now. And then talked about teachers being committed to the research, because I'd mentioned about this EEF thing, and that newspaper article is sort of saying that teachers aren't really sort of taking advantage of all these randomized controlled trials, and the teachers that we work with are very committed to research. And of course, these are teachers who have opted to work with the centre on not just on the teacher development programs, have then chosen to be involved in the research. So I think you highlight a really important issue here, that these are particularly motivated teachers who've probably got a particular interest in research and participating in research. And this might not be true of all teachers. And there's also a time issue. And I imagine it's the same for countries across the world, that teachers are incredibly busy. I mean, there's more work than I think they can fit in their days, and having to digest all this research on top of everything else is probably, it's a lot to be able to cope with, especially if you work in a school where you've got lots of other areas of responsibility as well. So you're mindful of that, but I do think that is something that we should be aware of, me at the centre, and also colleagues in other institutions who are doing this work, is thinking about the teachers and the students that we're working with and the schools that we're working with, and are they particularly motivated? What's motivated them to take part in the research, and are the groups of teachers and students who we're not engaging with? Because also this is making me think as well, and again, I assume this is probably the same in other institutions, that we present our research to an ethics panel, and we then get permission from parents for students to take part in the research. And by and large, for us, the students do generally take part, but depending on the nature of the study, there might be some parents going forward who wouldn't want their children to be involved, and then you kind of get a bit of a bias and a skew there maybe. So I think you've hit on a really important issue there, that we need to be really mindful of how we're gathering these samples, and any biases in the people who do take part, teachers and students, and those that don't take part. I think then your next one, looking at the scale of impact on students, or on a group of students, and also about interventions being inside of school and outside of school as well, which again, these are also really important considerations, I think, for this area of research. So I sort of mentioned that sometimes when we look at this data, the numbers don't suggest that there's been much of an impact. Or maybe, if you get a really large sample size, you can sometimes get a statistically significant finding, but it's actually a very small effect size, which means that actually in reality, it's only a couple of students that have been impacted upon. So yeah, we're looking at student level or group level. I think any improvement in or any impact or improvement in sort of intolerant attitudes, or any student that's galvanized to act or to change any bias, prejudice thinking they might have, is fantastic. I think when we're looking at these RCTs, we are, however, looking at groups of students, and I wonder whether we need to make sure that we go back to qualitative research to work in at sort of grassroots levels with individual students, finding out about their experiences of learning about the Holocaust. And in group or in school or outside school, I think is a really So I'm sort of thinking as I'm going here, and these kind of really exciting ideas. So I'm sort of just grabbing these thoughts as they're in kind of mid-flight sort of thing. But I think, you know, sort of the programs that we work with in England or in the centre, they're quite often are school-based. Obviously, I gave you the example of the randomized controlled trial where the students had gone out to a museum. And I think there is something very different for students, and almost the mode of delivery of the intervention has an impact as well, because when you're moving out of your normal setting and you go to a museum, for instance, you're outside of school, I don't know, that already makes it feel like it's important. Things might stick in your mind a little bit more. You might be looking at artifacts. You might meet a survivor, or increasingly see a survivor testimony maybe on a video. And I think what would be hard, I guess, for some of these studies is try to entangle whether it's the material and the content that they're learning about that's having the impact, and or the amount of additional impact that the mode of delivery is having, and whether the elements of outside school kind of enrich that maybe. I think it's a really interesting, can I come back to you on that one? I think it's a really, really interesting question. Yeah, looking at students already having these values when they come to Holocaust education, and also, just look at my notes, and the impact on other groups as well as adults, and also when these students become adults and they're looking back as well on their, you know, we're thinking back to when they were students about how longer term these values are. Yeah, I think we work with students and we work with teachers, and I think that that's a really interesting question about these students then become adults and what impact are these programs having on them in the longer term. And I guess it would be really interesting to do some research with different groups, and not just, I mean, I'm talking about students as well, or we work with students who are teenagers and they are aged typically from about 13 years, maybe up to 16 years. But university students, for instance, I think there's work that's being done with them. But then, of course, we know that university students in themselves are quite a particular group of people, and whether young adults who are the same sort of age in their early 20s, who don't go to university and go into the workplace, are maybe exposed to different, I don't know, they just have maybe just have sort of different life experiences. I think sometimes when you're at university, certainly my experience when I was at university, you're in a bit of a bubble, you know, and you sometimes you just the real world, especially like I said, my experience, I was at a campus university, and sort of the real world just seems a little bit distant sometimes, and how these things will compare to people who are still living in and working in their community a lot more directly, and the issues that they're facing. So I don't feel like I'm in a position to say too much of that with a great deal of experience, but I think that is, I think, again, I'm going to star this, and this is another really interesting area to explore. Yeah, and just looking again at this point about this history knowledge and about having sound historical knowledge, and that it's not just about sort of knowing the facts, but it's just how you use history as well. So you talked about sort of archival research and using testimonies, and of course something I don't think I really appreciated until I was a bit older and you sort of understand things a bit more, just about, you know, history and the testimonies you read and the historical records. It's through one person or group, or it's through a particular lens, isn't it? It's not necessarily what definitely happened at that time, but it might be somebody's interpretation of it when you're reading about their experiences, and about understanding that there might be different versions of the same event or period of history. And I think that is especially important for students at the moment. We're thinking about contemporary issues and the things that they're reading on the internet and fake news and all of those sorts of things. I don't know if that's what you meant, but that's where I'm sort of thinking in terms of the nature of understanding and interpreting and using history. So not just learning the historical facts, but actually just learning about interpretations and how you evaluate the strength of a source or the legitimacy of it, how you weigh up the evidence. And I think that is a really important element. And maybe that is, you know, I've talked about attitudes, behaviors, knowledge, sort of these things that I'd mentioned, these concepts that I've mentioned, and we're in my slides today. But actually, you're right. I think maybe impact studies that are looking at other areas. This skill set, almost, is developing these skills, this confidence, this critical thinking. I think that would be a really important area for those who are thinking of doing impact research. And in terms of other countries doing impact research, I think that would be brilliant. And I totally agree with you. I think that there will be crossover and there will be some things that overlap with different countries. But I think if somebody was to do maybe sort of, for instance, like a cross-country study, and you had several countries involved, you'd almost maybe have a core of questions that was the same, if it was possible to identify some that were the same, but that you'd also have a selection of questions that were just specific to that particular context, you know, and have an advisory group, or, you know, a group that could comment on that, because it's just so complicated, and the contemporary issues, I don't know, the effects of the media, you know, just the society in each individual, not even within each country. I mean, I don't know again about other places, but even in sort of England, the UK, even within a city, you know, there will be these differences and maybe different issues that we'd want to explore in an impact study. So I think other countries doing this would be great, and I think collaborations would be brilliant, but with scope to do some sort of individualized work as well. Is that, have I answered all? I don't know if I missed anything.
Yeah, but I'm wondering if I can follow up before that question.
No, I want to leave the floor open because I have other occasion to talk with Rebecca later.
So let's go.
So Diana, do you want to ask your question directly and introduce yourself?
Hi, sorry. Can you hear me? I just was wondering, I may have missed something. I had to step away for a short phone call at one point, but I was wondering.
Diana, we don't hear you. Are you speaking?
Yes, I am. Yes, I'm speaking, but.
We hear you now.
Do you hear me now? Yeah, okay. My question was just, I'm sorry if I missed this while I was on a very short phone call a few minutes ago, but I was just wondering if there are standardized survey questions that have been developed anywhere for administering to any and all Holocaust education classes. And I think they might involve maybe questions like, you know, do you think, you know, when you grow up, you'd like to, you know, study the history, or do you think you know, some of the topics that have been raised here, but also others that relate to historical knowledge or to values, or, you know, what's been discussed. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I think that's a really good question. And you'd almost think that actually there must have been some standardized survey questions that have been developed somewhere that somebody's using. And I think lots of researchers are trying to establish some survey questions. And certainly at my centre, you know, we've developed a survey that we've used. We use some of the questions quite often on different projects that we do. So a set of knowledge questions to just get some of the students' core knowledge. But it's hard with standardized questions because there aren't necessarily standardized programs. So although we've got sort of a core of a dozen knowledge questions that we encourage teachers to use with their students, not all of the teachers would have necessarily covered all of the material that relate to those questions. So I think that's why it's been a bit tricky to pin it down. But I think also because it's just so difficult when the historical ones may be a bit easier, although you then have to make a decision about how, from this very vast area of history, maybe the 12 questions that you're going to ask about, which involves, you know, identifying what you think are the key things and establishing benchmarks. And of course, you know, people might not agree with the things that you've selected. So even that I'm saying is more straightforward, but that is not without complication. But when you're looking at these more attitudinal or behavioral outcomes, it's actually, it's really hard. And I think most psychologists would tell you that it's really hard to develop really sound measures because, you know, we're complicated beings, aren't we? And trying to come up with a series of statements that tap in, you know, 4 or 5 attitudinal statements that tap into quite complex thinking is of course going to be very challenging. But that's not to say that it's impossible. And I think, you know, I do know of teams, or I've come across researchers who are trying to do this. And I think it would be fantastic if, even if it's a very short survey, and as we were just saying earlier, you know, people then add their own bits and amend things, but we have maybe a core of questions, a small selection of questions that can be used over and over again by teachers within one country or even across a few different countries, so that we can really start trying to get to grips. Because I think the frustration is, my frustration is, we know it's having an impact, and we know this impact is really profound and meaningful. And to be able to just understand that a little bit more would be fantastic, but also to be able to support the students who don't necessarily get there and sometimes feel a little bit sad or frustrated that they don't really feel like they've kind of had the same experience or responses. You know, so that all students are getting the most out of that area of their education would be really fantastic. So it's a work in progress, and hopefully over the next few years we'll make some advancements on that.
Are there other questions, or should we? Can I ask a question? Okay, so my question is, maybe you could guess it, but who knows? So you mentioned qualitative research as a potential for teasing out some of the, you know, some of the impact here, and but I was wondering how in what ways would you see that qualitative research could be useful? You know, just maybe even thinking out loud, what kinds of, you know, how is it that we might use qualitative methods to do that in a more specific way?
So how would we use qualitative research? So my instinct, like you say, sort of thinking out loudly, I think there'd be a few different ways. So I mean, we've done focus groups with students, and we get their feedback on the lessons and sort of, you know, sort of their experiences, and ask them directly what they think the impact was. The only issue with that, of course, is it's focus groups with students, so they're sharing the forum with a few other people, and so they can only maybe spend a total of 10 minutes, you know, if everybody takes their turns in total talking, and they're influenced by what other people around them are saying. I think you get that debate, and that in itself can trigger some really interesting insights. And you can capture that from students quite quickly after they've had their lessons, so it's still fresh in their mind. So that's a good thing. But equally, we've got the difficulty that these things, I think, take a while to kind of, you know, to sort of mentally digest them and to make sense of them. And I wonder whether, and again, I'm just thinking out loud, but if we did almost research with older students, young adults, possibly beyond that. And we're asking them to think back to when they first learned about the Holocaust, what they remember the impact having. And of course, that will be coloured by time, and they might misremember things, or things might not be as fresh in their minds. But I suppose it would enable you to explore that kind of more longer term impacts. And they can say, well, I learned about it when I was 14, and it's sort of, you know, it stuck with me, but I wasn't able to do this, that, and the other. And then I, you know, left school, or, you know, I started working in this particular role, and then it stayed with me. And then, like, do you know, so they're sort of talking a bit more in terms of their life experiences and how they think that might have had an impact. Obviously, I can already hear people now who are more of the quantitative stream or randomized controlled trial advocates, for instance, saying, well, you're working with a much smaller sample, and how you can't generalize that. But I don't think that's it's not my area of expertise, but I don't think that that's the point of that sort of research when you're working with a small number of people, you know, sort of life histories and trying to understand their particular experiences. But I think all of these things are almost like a portfolio of evidence. All of these things together, I think, enrich our understanding. So it's almost not trying to say, well, one is better than, research method is better than the other. They answer different research questions, and maybe we do all of these different things, and then we kind of bring it all together, and then we try and make sense of what it is that we're looking at. But that's, yeah, well, I'll think about it more. And